The desert wind carried a mournful whistle that night, a sound that rattled the shutters of the small, forgotten town on the edge of the frontier. Dust moved like restless spirits across the main street, winding its way between the saloon and the livery stable, past the weary church that leaned slightly as though burdened by the sins it had witnessed. In that town, on that night, a man with a broken heart crossed paths with a woman who had been thrown away like she was worth less than the dust beneath his boots. She hadn't always been a ghost of herself. Once, her laughter had filled a warm kitchen, and her hands had worked with purpose, mending shirts and setting bread to rise while she dreamed of children who might one day fill her home with life. But dreams are fragile things in the Wild West, where love could turn sour as fast as milk left in the sun. Her husband, a man of harsh words and harder fists, had decided she was no longer useful. She had not given him sons, and in his bitterness, he cast her out as though she were little more than a mule gone lame. The townsfolk pretended not to notice. They turned their eyes away when she walked, shoulders stooped, carrying what little she had in a frayed sack. Whispers followed her, words like, useless, and, worn out, clung to her like burrs. In those days, a woman without a man was as good as invisible, and worse than invisible was a woman cast aside. Miles away, across the rolling plains where the grass swayed golden in the sun, lived a man whose heart was as parched as the land itself. His name was Elias McGraw, a cattleman with sprawling acres, a fortune built on sweat and risk, and a loneliness that no amount of money could silence. He had buried a wife once, years ago, when fever swept mercilessly through the valley. Since then, he had lived surrounded by men, cowhands, ranch hands, trail riders, yet he felt the ache of solitude pressing on him every night. A big house stood at the center of his ranch, filled with silence so thick he sometimes swore he could hear the echo of his own heartbeat in the dark. Fate has a way of drawing broken souls together, not with kindness but with storms. Elias rode into town that week for supplies, his broad-shouldered frame and fine horse marking him as a man of means. He passed men who tipped their hats respectfully and women who watched him with shy interest, for wealth and land made him desirable, even if grief had hardened his eyes. He had no intention of finding anything in town beyond flour, salt, and fresh tools for his ranch. But fate does not ask permission. He first saw her outside the saloon, not with painted lips and coquettish smiles like the women who leaned in doorways, but standing in the shadows, her eyes downcast, her face pale under the flickering lantern light. She looked like a discarded scrap, a figure people moved past without seeing. Elias noticed the way a man sneered at her, shoving her shoulder as though she were in the way. She did not protest, only lowered her gaze further, as if to become smaller. Something in Elias stirred, something raw and angry. Later, inside the saloon, the talk of men carried through whiskey-laced laughter. A ranch hand from another spread leaned back in his chair and spat tobacco juice into a corner before saying, "That fella, her husband, done tossed her out. Said she ain't worth the bread she eats. Can't give him no children. Tried tradin' her off for a stack of poker chips." The men laughed cruelly, the sound scraping against Elias's chest like barbed wire. A game was underway, and though Elias had no interest in cards, he found himself drifting near. At the center of the table sat the husband, red-faced, drunk, boasting. "Don't need her no more," he slurred. "Hell, any man with coin in his pocket can have her." His words hung in the air, foul and heavy. Elias should have walked away. This wasn't his fight. He had enough ghosts in his life without taking on another soul's misery. But when he glanced toward the door, he saw her standing there, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, her hands twisting in front of her like a penitent awaiting judgment. Something in her expression, resignation mixed with a sliver of desperate hope, tore through the armor Elias had built around his heart. "I'll take her," Elias said, his voice low but steady. The laughter stilled. Cards slapped onto the table. The husband squinted, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "You, McGraw, what in blazes would a man like you want with her?" Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a stack of bills, more money than any man in that saloon had seen laid down in months. He placed it calmly on the table. For her freedom, not as property, as a choice. She leaves with me, and you never trouble her again. The room erupted in jeers and mocking, but the husband's greed outweighed his pride. His hands twitched toward the money, eyes gleaming. Hell, take her, she ain't worth half that, but if you're fool enough. He shoved the bills into his pocket, muttering something vile. The woman gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Elias turned toward her, offering a hand not as a captor, but as a man offering salvation. For a moment, she hesitated, uncertainty battling with exhaustion. Then, slowly, she placed her trembling hand into his. As they stepped out into the cool night, the laughter of drunken men echoed behind them, but the sound seemed far away. The lantern light caught her face, and for the first time, Elias saw the woman behind the sorrow. Her eyes, though dulled by pain, still carried a glimmer of strength. "You don't owe me anything," Elias said quietly as he helped her onto his horse. "But if you want a place where you're safe, where no one will treat you like that again, my ranch has room." She didn't speak. Instead, she held onto the saddle horn tightly, as though afraid the world might vanish if she let go. They rode into the night, away from the jeers and whispers, toward the endless horizon where broken hearts sometimes found healing in the unlikeliest of places. The ride back to the McGraw Ranch stretched long beneath the wide western sky. The moon hung high, pale and watchful, spilling silver light across the plains. Elias's horse moved at a steady trot, hooves drumming softly against the hard earth. The woman sat rigid in front of him, her thin frame tense, her silence louder than any words. Elias did not press her. He knew enough of grief and loss to recognize the weight she carried. By the time they reached the sprawling ranch, the horizon was bruised with dawn. The bunkhouse lamps flickered with sleepy cowhands stirring, and the lowing of cattle echoed from the pens. Elias swung down first, then reached for her. She hesitated, eyes darting as though she expected another cruel twist, but finally placed her hand in his and slid to the ground. Inside the ranch house, the air was cool and faintly scented with cedar. Elias led her to the kitchen, where he set a kettle on the stove and poured water into a tin cup. "Drink," he said softly. She accepted it, hands shaking, and sipped as though water itself were a fragile gift. "You'll stay here," Elias continued. "This house has too much room for one man. There's a guest room down the hall. No one will trouble you." Her lips parted as though to speak, but only a whisper came. "Why?" The question hung heavy. Why would a wealthy rancher take in a woman discarded like worn boots? Elias shifted, his broad shoulders stiffening. He thought of the nights he'd sat alone by the fire, staring at his late wife's rocking chair, untouched for years. He thought of the way grief hollowed a man, how it left him raw beneath the skin. And he thought of her, standing in that saloon like a lamb among wolves, eyes filled with a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to see her worth. "Because no one deserves to be treated like nothing," he finally said. Days passed in quiet rhythms. She moved carefully through the house, like a ghost uncertain of its welcome. She tidied the kitchen, swept the floors, and mended a tear in one of Elias's shirts, though he had not asked her to. He noticed the way she hummed softly under her breath when she worked, as though testing the sound of her own voice again after years of silence. The men on the ranch spoke in hushed tones about her, curious but cautious. They had seen Elias's temper flare before, and none dared question his decisions. Still, whispers floated, about the woman cast aside, about the money exchanged. Elias ignored them. He had no patience for gossip. One evening, he found her sitting on the porch, staring at the sun sinking into the horizon, painting the sky in fire. He joined her, settling into the chair beside hers. For a long time, neither spoke. The cicadas buzzed, and the cattle lowed in the distance. Finally, she broke the silence. "My name is Clara." Elias turned his head slowly, committing the sound of her name to memory. Clara. It suited her, soft yet resilient, like the wildflowers that managed to bloom between rocks. "You've been kind," she said, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "But you don't know me. You don't know what he said about me." Elias's jaw tightened. "I don't need to. A man who throws away his wife like yesterday's trash says more about himself than about her." Her eyes shimmered, and she turned quickly, hiding tears. For a moment, Elias wanted to reach out, to take her hand, but something held him back. He knew wounds as deep as hers could not be rushed. Healing was like coaxing a skittish colt. You needed patience, gentleness, and time. The weeks rolled on. Clara began to move more freely in the house, her shoulders less stooped, her steps less hesitant. She tended the small garden out back, coaxing green shoots from the dry soil, her hands steady, purposeful. Elias found himself pausing in his work to watch her, though he told himself it was only curiosity. One afternoon, a storm swept across the plains, black clouds rolling like cannon smoke. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked so loud the very walls trembled. Clara, pale and trembling, retreated to the corner of the room, arms wrapped tight around herself. Elias entered to find her crouched low, eyes wide with fear. "It's just a storm," he said gently, kneeling beside her. Her breath came in sharp gasps. He used to lock me outside, in storms, said I should learn to be strong." Her voice broke, raw with old terror. Something inside Elias burned hot, a fury not at her but at the cruelty she had endured. Without hesitation, he drew her close, his arms wrapping around her trembling frame. At first she resisted, stiff and uncertain, but slowly, her body sagged against his, the sobs shaking her chest muffled against his shirt. "You're safe now," Elias murmured, his voice steady as a rock beneath the storm's fury. "No one will ever hurt you here." For the first time since she arrived, Clara allowed herself to believe it. After that night, something shifted. She began to meet his gaze more often, her eyes no longer darting away like a frightened bird. She laughed once, a small sound, startled from her when a young cold nipped at Elias's hat, and the sound caught him off guard, warming something deep inside him that had long been cold. But healing is never a straight path. One evening, when Elias returned late from tending cattle, he found Clara standing at the door with her bundle packed, tears streaking her face. "I shouldn't stay," she whispered. "People will talk. They'll say I'm bored." Elias stepped closer, his shadow falling across her small frame. "Let them talk. Folks always will. But you are not what they say. You're not his cast-off. You're Clara. You're stronger than any of them know." Her hands shook as she clutched the bundle, torn between leaving and staying. Elias did not beg, did not demand. He only placed a hand over hers, steady and sure. "If you walk away, I won't stop you. But if you stay, you'll never have to face this world alone again." The silence stretched, heavy with choice. Finally, her fingers loosened on the bundle, and she let it fall to the floor. That night, as the stars spread wide across the endless sky, two broken hearts found themselves not healed, but mending, stitch by stitch, moment by moment, in the quiet of a house that no longer felt empty. Morning came soft and golden, the light spilling across the wide prairie as though the land itself wished to bless new beginnings. Clara rose earlier than usual, moving quietly through the kitchen, her hands steady as she kneaded dough. The smell of baking bread drifted through the house, a scent Elias had not known since his wife passed. When he entered, boots heavy with dust, he paused at the threshold, struck by the simple warmth of it. Clara looked up, startled, then lowered her gaze as if she had trespassed by offering comfort. Elias shook his head, pulling out a chair. "Smells like home," he said. The words made her cheeks flush, and though she said nothing, a faint smile tugged at her lips. She began to carve a rhythm in the ranch life, tending the garden, cooking meals, sometimes mending the cowhands' clothes when they left them at the back door with awkward gratitude. Slowly, she grew steadier, her laughter peeking through more often, like sunlight slipping between storm clouds. Elias found himself listening for it, the sound striking him in places he thought long dead. But outside the ranch, the whispers had not ceased. When Elias rode into town, men nudged one another, smirking. Women cast disapproving glances, lips tight with judgment. One merchant's wife muttered loud enough for him to hear, "Bought himself a woman," as though she were cattle. Elias ignored it, but the words sank like burrs under the skin. One afternoon, Clara accompanied him to town for supplies. She wore a simple calico dress, her hair braided neatly, though her hands trembled as they entered the mercantile. Conversations faltered, eyes following her like arrows. Clara shrank beneath their stares, clutching a basket so tightly her knuckles whitened. Elias moved beside her, his presence towering and steady. When the merchant's wife sneered, Elias turned to her, voice calm but edged with steel. "A man's worth is measured in how he treats those under his roof. I reckon that makes Clara worth more than most here." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the shuffle of boots and the clink of coin. Clara said nothing, but when they stepped outside, tears brimmed in her eyes, not from shame, but from the rare gift of being defended. That night, she stood on the porch with Elias, the stars burning bright overhead. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered. "Shouldn't have told the truth." He asked. "They'll only talk more. Let them. Words don't break bones, but they can heal hearts if spoken at the right time." Her gaze lifted, meeting his, and in that moment, something passed between them, unspoken, fragile, and powerful. As weeks turned into months, Clara found new strength in the rancher's rhythm. She learned to ride one of the gentler horses, her laughter bright as the wind tangled her hair. She tended to an orphaned calf with such devotion that even the hardest cowhand softened in her presence. Slowly, she stitched herself back into life, piece by piece. Elias watched from a distance, pride stirring in his chest. He had not expected this when he first laid down money in that saloon. He had not expected to see her rise from ashes, to see her smile without fear. And he had not expected the ache in his chest each time he looked at her to feel less like sorrow and more like longing. One evening, after a long day branding cattle, Elias returned to find Clara asleep in the rocking chair on the porch, a book slipping from her hands. The lamplight cast a warm glow on her face, softening the lines of weariness into something almost angelic. He stood there for a long time, silent, feeling something deep within him shift. It was not the hollow ache of loss that had haunted him for years. It was something new, something alive. But Elias was a cautious man. He had lived long enough to know that hearts, once broken, do not mend easily. He feared pressing too soon, feared shattering the fragile trust Clara had built. So he kept his distance, even as every fiber in him longed to close the space between them. Clara, too, felt the shift. She caught herself watching him when he worked, his broad shoulders glistening with sweat under the sun, his steady hands guiding cattle with calm authority. She noticed the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, how he never raised it, never demanded, only offered. In him, she saw strength not in cruelty but in kindness. And it frightened her, because she had once believed in love, and it had nearly destroyed her. Their fragile peace was tested one market day in town. Clara had gone alone to fetch cloth while Elias loaded supplies. Her former husband was there, drunk and mean, his face flushed with spite. He cornered her outside the mercantile, words dripping venom. "Thought you'd land on your feet, didn't you? But you're nothing more than a bought trinket. Everyone knows it. He'll tire of you too." His hand shot out, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. Before she could cry out, Elias was there. His fist cracked across the man's jaw with a sound like splitting wood. The brute crumpled, cursing, blood on his lip. Elias stood over him, voice low but sharp as a blade. "Touch her again, and you'll wish you hadn't drawn breath." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Clara trembled, tears welling, but this time they were not of fear, they were of relief, of vindication. Elias's hand found hers, steady and sure, leading her away as murmurs spread through the crowd. Back at the ranch, she collapsed onto a chair, shaking. Elias knelt before her, guilt heavy in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I should have never let you go alone." She reached for him then, fingers brushing his cheek where dust still clung. "Don't apologize. Her voice broke, tears spilling freely. "You saved me again." In that moment, something inside both of them broke open. The walls built from years of pain and loneliness crumbled, leaving only two souls, raw and unguarded. Elias took her trembling hands in his voice rough. "Clara, I never meant for this to happen. But I can't look at you without wanting more than just to keep you safe. I want," he faltered, words caught in his throat. Her tears shimmered in the lamplight, but she did not pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice soft but certain. "Then stop holding back." The distance between them vanished, and for the first time, Elias tasted the sweetness of her lips, fragile yet fierce, like a promise whispered against the roar of a storm. The kiss was not long, nor was it practiced. It was hesitant, trembling, born not of passion alone but of pain and longing, of two hearts daring to reach beyond the scars that bound them. When they finally parted, Clara's breath lingered against Elias's cheek, and for a moment, the world felt impossibly still. Elias drew back first, his chest heaving as though he had just ridden 100 miles. He searched her eyes, fearful he had overstepped, fearful he had taken too much. But Clara's gaze held no fear, only a glimmer of something he had not seen in her before, trust. The days that followed were unlike any Elias had known. The silence in the house no longer felt heavy. It was filled with Clara's laughter, the hum of her voice as she worked, the soft shuffle of her footsteps in the hall. She moved through the rooms not like a guest but like someone beginning to believe she belonged. Elias found himself lingering in the kitchen when she cooked, inventing excuses to pass through the garden when she knelt among the rows of beans and squash. One evening, she surprised him with supper laid out on the table, the dishes simple yet arranged with care. Elias sat across from her, candlelight flickering between them. He ate in silence at first, savoring more than just the food. Then, quietly, he said, "It feels like a home again." Clara looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "It never felt like one for me before. Not with him." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "But here it's different." Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to reach across the table, to take her hands, but he forced himself to wait, to let her set the pace. Yet not all welcomed the bond that was forming. The townsfolk's whispers grew louder. At church, Clara felt the weight of every stare, the sting of judgment pressing on her back. Some women refused to sit beside her, the disdain sharp and unyielding. Men muttered behind Elias's back, questioning his choices. One Sunday, after service, a matron confronted Clara directly, her tone dripping with scorn. "A woman who was bought has no place among decent wives. Don't think you'll ever be one of us." Clara's breath hitched, her face pale, but before Elias could speak, Clara lifted her chin. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "Maybe I was thrown away. Maybe I was bought, but I wasn't bought for chains. I was given a chance to live again. And I won't let your words take that from me." The crowd murmured, some shocked, some approving, and Elias's heart swelled with pride. He saw the strength she was discovering within herself, a strength even she hadn't believed she possessed. That night, he told her so, his voice rough with emotion. "You're braver than anyone I've ever known." Clara shook her head, tears brimming. "I'm only brave because you gave me the chance to be." Elias reached for her then, pulling her close. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear of breaking something fragile. His lips found hers again, firmer, deeper, sealing a promise unspoken but understood. Their love grew slowly, like wildflowers pushing through rocky soil. Clara tended the ranch with him, her hands blistered yet steady as she learned to brand calves, to mend fences, to ride out with him on long evenings to check the herd. Elias, in turn, found joy in small things again, the way she laughed when the colt tried to nip at her dress, the way she sang softly while hanging laundry, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him across the supper table. But the past was not so easily silenced. One night, Clara woke screaming, tangled in sheets, her body trembling as old memories clawed their way from the dark. Elias rushed to her side, his arms wrapping around her, his voice low and steady. "It's over. He can't touch you anymore. You're safe." She clung to him, sobbing into his chest, and he held her until the tremors faded. In those moments, Elias realized his love for her was not the fiery infatuation of youth but something deeper, something forged in the crucible of pain and healing. He did not want her just as a companion, he wanted her as a partner, an equal, someone who could face the harsh world beside him. As autumn painted the plains with gold and crimson, Elias found himself pacing the porch one evening, a small box clutched in his hand. Inside lay a simple silver band, modest compared to his wealth, but chosen with care. He had carried it for days, waiting for the right moment, the right words. Clara joined him on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. She looked at him with a smile that reached her eyes, and Elias knew the moment had come. He stepped closer, his rough hands trembling as he opened the box. "Clara," he said, his voice thick, "when I first saw you, I only wanted to save you from a man's cruelty. I never expected you'd save me in return. My heart was buried long ago, but you brought it back to life. I don't care what the town says, what whispers follow us. I care only for you. Will you be my wife?" Clara's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming freely. For a long moment, she could not speak, her breath catching in sobs. Then, with a trembling laugh, she nodded. "Yes, Elias, 1,000 times, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as he drew her into his arms, the stars burned bright above them, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to two hearts that had found each other in the most unlikely of ways. Their wedding was not grand, nor was it adorned with riches. It was held beneath the wide sky, the prairie grass swaying gently in the autumn breeze, the horizon painted in strokes of orange and crimson. Only a handful of ranch hands, a traveling preacher, and a few townsfolk with kinder hearts attended. Clara wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, the fabric plain but the love in every stitch undeniable. Elias stood tall beside her, his weathered face softened by a joy none had seen in years. When the preacher asked Elias if he would take Clara as his wife, his answer rang out strong and steady, "With all I am, for as long as I breathe." Clara's response was softer, trembling with tears, but every bit as resolute, "Yes. Always yes." As they kissed, sealing their vows, the small gathering cheered, though whispers still floated from the edge of the crowd. But for the first time, Clara did not hear judgment in them, only the fading echoes of a past she no longer belonged to. She was no longer the discarded wife of a cruel man. She was Clara Morgan, beloved of Elias, partner of the ranch, mistress of her own destiny. Married life brought its own rhythm, not free from hardship but rich in shared burdens. Clara woke early to help with the cattle drives, her skirts often dust-stained, her hands blistered. Elias, in turn, found himself lingering in the kitchen more often, awkwardly learning the art of kneading bread or fetching water just to be near her. Their evenings were filled with quiet companionship, reading by lamplight, walking the fields beneath the stars, or simply sitting together in the hush of the prairie night. Yet challenges rose, as they always do in the untamed West. A harsh winter swept through the land, colder and crueler than any Elias could recall. Snow piled high against the barn, and bitter winds howled across the plains, testing both cattle and human alike. Feed grew scarce, and more than once, Elias returned from the fields with frost clinging to his beard, his body weary to breaking. Clara, though, was his anchor. She stoked the fires, nursed the weak calves with warm milk, and stood beside him in every battle the cold waged against them. One night, When the storm rattled the windows and the ranch hands huddled in silence, Clara knelt beside Elias as he sat by the fire, exhaustion etched into his face. She took his calloused hand in hers and whispered, "We'll survive this together." In that moment, Elias realized that the vow they had spoken beneath the autumn sky was not just poetry, it was truth, lived daily in sweat, in pain, and in love that refused to falter. Spring finally came, painting the land green once more. New calves were born, flowers bloomed in the meadows, and the ranch breathed with fresh life. With the thaw came visitors, neighbors and townsfolk, some still wary, others curious. Slowly, the same people who once whispered against Clara began to see the truth of her place at Elias's side. They saw the ranch prosper under her care, saw her kindness toward the workers, her strength in hardship, her unwavering devotion to the man who had given her not just shelter but a second chance at life. In time, even the cruelest tongues grew quiet. The merchant's wife, once so sharp, offered a hesitant nod in town. Children ran to Clara for sweets she carried in her apron, their laughter erasing the last shadows of doubt. Clara no longer shrank beneath the weight of others' eyes. She met them head-on, her chin lifted, her heart steady. She was no longer the woman who had walked into that saloon broken and discarded. She was reborn. Years slipped by, marked by harvests, storms, and sunrises over the endless plains. Clara and Elias grew older together, their love not fading but deepening, like roots burrowed into rich soil. They faced sorrow, loss of cattle, sickness that swept the valley, the passing of friends, but they faced it hand in hand. One summer evening, long after the ranch had quieted and the workers had gone to their bunks, Elias and Clara sat on the porch. The air was warm, the sky streaked with the last blush of sunset. Clara leaned against his shoulder, her silver-threaded hair catching the fading light. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. Elias turned his head, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Buying you that night." His voice held both gravity and tenderness. "Never. It was the best choice I ever made. I thought I was saving you, Clara. But truth is, you saved me." Her eyes shimmered with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Then we saved each other." The prairie stretched before them, endless and eternal, the same land that had borne their struggles, their triumphs, and their love. They sat in silence, the kind born of deep companionship, knowing that though the world might forget their story, the land would remember. The wind carried their laughter, their sorrows, and their vows across the grasslands, weaving them into the very fabric of the Wild West. And so the tale of a rich cowboy and a forsaken woman was not one of tragedy, but of redemption, healing, and love that endured where none had expected it to.